After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, a huge gray area was formed between Russia and NATO. Virtually all of Eastern Europe was outside the bloc and served as a buffer between Moscow and the West. But after a while, the balance of power in Europe began to change. Some countries from the gray zone began to join NATO. In 1999, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary joined NATO. In 2004, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Romania, and Bulgaria joined NATO. In 2009, Albania and Croatia joined NATO. And recently, North Macedonia and Montenegro were also accepted into NATO. Seeing all this, Russia began to argue that NATO was moving eastward, towards Russia's borders, and that this posed a threat to Russia. Russia has always stated that it will not allow Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO. This is already a red line that NATO should not cross. Russian propaganda over the years has completely distorted the truth about NATO expansion in Europe. But what is actually true? Having studied this question for myself, I clearly understand this. It is not NATO moving to the east, it is the east moving into NATO. It is very important to understand the exact direction of the movement. The movement is not from west to east, but from east to west. NATO is not forcing Eastern European countries to become part of its alliance. It is the Eastern European countries themselves that want to join NATO. In some countries, particularly Ukraine and Georgia, are even begging NATO to accept them. You have to agree, it sounds very different. In fact, the Eastern European countries are running away from Russia. They feel threatened by Moscow. Let us remember that the NATO alliance was created precisely to protect against the Soviet Union, but now it serves to protect against Russia. The fact is that Russia has not gotten rid of its imperial ambitions. A buffer or gray zone between Russia and NATO is impossible in principle. This gray zone will be absorbed by Russia sooner or later. All Eastern European countries may again fall under Russian occupation. They understand this, and that is why they want to join NATO, to protect themselves from Russian aggression. Take Ukraine as an example. This country has been under Russian occupation for centuries. And now, being a free independent country for over 30 years, they do not want to go back under Russian rule. For Ukraine, this would mean a path to the past, degradation, destruction, and enslavement. Seeing Moscow's imperial ambitions to rebuild its empire and take control of the former Soviet Union, Ukraine practically begged on its knees for NATO to accept them. NATO, on the other hand, is in no hurry to expand. Ukraine was refused to become a member of the alliance. So, all of Putin's accusations against NATO are pure manipulation and a distortion of reality. Putin should be asked another question. Why does Eastern Europe want to join NATO? Why are these countries running away from Russia? Since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the people of Eastern Europe have tended to move to the West. The pattern of people emigrating shows this very well. Millions of people have left Ukraine for the West in the last 30 years. Interestingly enough, the same thing is happening to Russia. Millions of Russians are also leaving en masse for the West. Those people who are afraid of going back to the Soviet Union and the loss of freedom are moving farther away from Moscow. There is no reverse trend. No one from the US or Western Europe goes to live in Russia. After all, in Russia, you can easily get thrown in jail for criticizing Putin on social networks. Moving to the West is the natural desire of people for freedom. That is why it is important to understand this. NATO expansion is not happening aggressively against Russia. NATO is not imposing itself, just as the European Union is not imposing itself on Ukraine or Moldova or Georgia. It is Ukraine itself asking to join NATO, asking to join the European Union to become part of the West. Russia is still sick with its imperial ambitions. The Kremlin has plans to regain lost territories. The buffer zone will sooner or later be absorbed by Moscow.